January 29, 2026. It's year 4, day 340 since the full-scale invasion began. Welcome. For the Daily Situation Report, in today's report, we will look at some territorial gains on the Russian side. We will also look at how the Russians are further upgrading their Russian head drones and what Ukraine wants to do about it. And what we also see are reports from the Russian unofficial Air Force channel, such as on fighter bomber, which are actually very interesting, as well as much more. At Vovchansk, the Russians completely captured the eastern axis, which is the axis up here that basically connects the north and south banks of the Vovchka over the dashed line. Back then, the Ukrainians were able to create another supply route towards Vovchansk, which means they were able to do so at that time. You have to think back a bit. At that time, these 3 bridges here were still under Ukrainian control. The Russians were somewhere up here in the north. The Ukrainians actually had control over this entire area down here, and they were also able to continue supplying through this route and carry out attacks as well. If these 3 bridges were treated more or less defensively, that means they could exert a lot of pressure. But now the Russians have been able to expand further here. They have more or less completely captured the entire southern part of Vovchansk here, and now also this actually very important access road, today's territorial gain. This is credited to the Russian 128th. Motorized Rifle Brigade of the 44th Army is located here and in the yellow-marked area. We can clearly see it in this offensive case. The 113th is reporting here, Ukrainian Territorial Defense Brigade, that they were able to repel Russian attacks mainly with drones right here in this area. Currently, they are attacking from the west and not from the north, although by capturing it, they now have a second attack route available, which they will certainly use in the future as well. I can also imagine the Russians will try to advance further east to capture these buildings too, which of course will allow them to fully exploit the separation created by the Vovchka. Shahed drones are generally simple drones, and so is the Russian copy, meaning the licensed version. The Garant 2, which only differs in a few parts that are important for communication, is very similar to the Shahed as a simple drone. You simply assign it a target, then launch it, and after that there's nothing more, no further control. Whether they hit or miss the target then depends on many different factors, such as electronic countermeasures, air defense, or simply the components of the drones or the skills of the drone operators. Here they gave the coordinates, which they got from intelligence services or ground units, who might also make mistakes. The Russians now have little influence over that. But over time, we saw that they kept attaching more special parts to the Shahed, for example mines, so that it could kill rescue workers when it crashes, extra explosives for a second blast, or jamming devices for infrared-guided missiles, such as flares, as well as anti-aircraft measures to hit helicopters and airplanes, like mounted man-pads, which we saw a few days ago. The latter would even mean that the Russians have at least some kind of optical surveillance on this modified drone, like a camera with live transmission, for example. We're seeing this more often now, and there are also reports of Shaheds using Starlink terminals. And now we also see a very low-flying Shahed drone that is trying to evade Ukrainian air defense and is currently being pursued by a Ukrainian helicopter. According to the source, it is being remotely controlled by a drone pilot because it displayed unusual flight patterns. This has great advantages for the Russians because it allows them to hit moving targets or precisely guide the Shahed drone to a target if it deviates by a few meters. So while the Ukrainians continue to expand their drone sea fleet with the Sea Babies, the Russians are constantly improving the Shahed. The Gerard 2 drone, which they can now produce in fairly large numbers. And we're talking about nearly 800 a day here. Something that also fits well with this topic is the following. According to the Ukrainian Minister of Defense, the Ministry of Defense is working together with SPACEX on this. The problem with using Starlink terminals on the front is to technically prevent or at least significantly restrict the misuse of satellite communication by Russian unmanned systems. That's what the Ukrainians say, but I could imagine it being difficult. since they themselves also equip sea drones with Starlink and use them for attacks. Sea drones strike, but they also avoid hitting residential buildings where civilians live. How they want to argue that point and whether they'll hit a sore spot at SPACEX remains questionable, of course. Another Russian Penguin soldier has been filmed. I seriously wonder who gave them that idea. You're not any less visible than if you just put on a white sheet or anything else that's white. The only difference is they see worse as they can't see to the sides, only straight ahead. And their arms can't be used, which suggests that they can't use their weapon. So you're more or less defenseless against a drone. You don't do something like that for fun. You do it because someone must have convinced these soldiers that drones can't spot them then, or something along those lines. You can leave your tip in the comments, and if you haven't already, feel free to subscribe. Near Vovchansk, a Russian Lancet kamikaze drone got caught in a protective net. The target of the attack was vehicles moving well behind their own front line. We're talking about roughly 40 kilometers from the front. However, the drone was stopped by the net and couldn't reach its target. Such a net is probably a good and inexpensive way to stop some drones, especially against a Lancet, which has a rather rigid flight path and is light enough not to break through. It would be different with a fiberglass drone, which can counteract electronic countermeasures to some extent and deliberately exploit gaps in the net. Many say all roads should have these nets, but that's a difficult task since they're not available everywhere. Ukraine has also relied on many fishing nets from the Netherlands, which were donated specifically for such corridors. At the same time, there are many volunteers who are building such nets. Since large-scale production apparently isn't possible, or at least isn't able to replace the current nets when they're hit, and at the same time provide more roads. The Russian Channel Fader bomber reports the loss of another Su-34. It was reportedly over the Black Sea near the Ukrainian coast. The last contact was made before it disappeared. It is currently believed it was shot down. On the Russian side, things are unusually quiet, especially for Fader bomber, who only shared a pilot's poem about it. Let's wait a few days and see. The Ukrainian specialist portal, Militar, has analyzed Russian armament documents that dealt with the procurement of artillery ammunition. The detailed analysis leaves many conclusions open. For example, the numbers show Russia is ordering large amounts of ammunition in 2024 and 2025, but with clear shifts in priorities. Hundreds of thousands of 82, 120, 122, and 152 mm shells were ordered, along with smaller amounts of heavy 203 and 240 mm calibers. What stands out in particular is the strong increase in 120 mm mortar ammunition, while the heaviest calibers remain largely unchanged. This means that Russia is increasingly relying on flexible mortar systems, while very heavy artillery is increasingly being replaced by glide or guided bombs from the air. It's also interesting that the shift in calibers does not match the known or Ukrainian reported artillery losses. While losses of 122 mm systems have increased compared to 152 mm, this is hardly reflected in the procurement figures. This suggests that Russia has to operate existing systems intensively, even though their losses at the front are above average. Another important point that should not be underestimated is that production capacities are slowly becoming largely exhausted. In almost all calibers, the increases from 2024 to 2025 are relatively small. A real increase can essentially only be seen with the 120 mm mortar shells because those continue to rise. So this suggests that the Russian arms industry is reaching its limits and can only achieve significant growth in selected areas because everything is still needed at the front. Additionally, there is a trend toward long-range ammunition. Russian artillery is staying farther behind the front to better protect itself from Ukrainian counterattacks and drone reconnaissance. Thank you to all subscribers, channel members, and the Algo crew, especially Lieutenant Colonel Renneke, Robert Siller, Dietrich Freddy, and Mayor Hofer. Feel free to leave me a subscription, a like, and comments, and see you in the next situation report.